The Australian electricity supply industry prides itself on being one of the country's strongest driving forces of its economic power on the world stage. But with this global power comes a degree of uncertainty that has posed problem areas for the industry past and present, and assuredly its foreseeable future. These uncertainties arise from influences that generate from the micro and macro environments of the industry, ranging from employees to the environment and technology. The Australian electricity supply industry has implemented a strategic framework that focuses on an abundance of low-cost, homegrown energy resources. This has allowed for the country to develop strong international economic relationships with countries such as China and Japan. Despite all these foundations that allowed the industry to prosper in the past, still remains the uncertainty of what pathway the industry will follow in the future to adapt to the volatile conditions of the micro and macro environments. During this video, 4 scenarios will be presented detailing a possible pathway that the Australian electricity industry may head down. These future scenarios will be detailed and analysed in a time frame of 15 years, ending in 2032. To assist in the development of the 4 scenarios, 2 uncertainties will be outlined to distinguish between the macro environments of the scenarios. These will comprise of the level of government funding and the impact of technology. During this future, we see the government take a strong interest in the balance of advancement of technology and the preservation of environmental conditions. The shift in attitude by the industry is due to increasing pressure from social groups for the industry to cut its environmentally detrimental practices. Resulting from this, the industry experiences a high level of research, with universities investing time and money for sustainable renewable energy sources such as battery storage and the newly discovered resource of nuclear fusion, allowing to produce energy with little to no effect on the environment in the sense of CO2 emissions. Infrastructure within the supply industry is totally overhauled, as funding is stockpiled into the building of numerous power plants around the country to accommodate nuclear fusion. Economic consequences are felt around the year 2026, as the country becomes the primary producer and distributor of energy on the global stage, causing an all-time hike in economic GDP. In 2029, more than half Australian households are fully dependent on nuclear energy and battery storage, and eventually by the time 2032 arrives, Australia is now truly the global leader in energy production and experiencing no noticeable effects on the environment. This scenario illustrates conditions where technology advancements are at a low point and very little, if none, funding is invested into research of new renewable sources of energy. This leads to the government zeroing their focus onto renewable sources already discovered, such as solar, wind thermal, and hydropower energy. Funding will instead be directed at the development of regulation and policies that promote green initiative behaviours by citizens and the industry. These policies are backed and funded by NGOs, councils, and the general population, who are growingly becoming more aware of the carbon footprint their old behaviours have been leaving behind. By 2023, 30% of residential and business buildings will be totally reliant on solar energy, resulting in a decline of 20% in the reliance on burning coal and natural gas across Australia. 2029 will see the government funding a shake-up in the infrastructure of the electricity industry, as giant wind thermal and solar panel farms will be built in coastal and desert areas respectively. As the end of the 15-year timeframe comes around, this green future will be strongly influenced and perpetuated by societal pressure due to growing concern for the environment, thus shaping political behaviour to focus on these interests society holds. This results in wiping out any reliance on coal and natural gas burning for energy production, making Australia #1 globally for green energy production. As the electricity supply industry follows this route, little care will be held for environmental impact and the advancement of technology. A high demand for energy across the country is occurring, as overconsumption is the societal norm due to the population being focused on their own progress and not the generations to come. During this time frame, to cater for the increased demand, a growth in electricity supply will occur. This will involve more mining sites to be constructed for coal and natural gas, thus more jobs for the economy. As demand and supply continue in an imbalanced state, electricity prices skyrocket. In effect, the government implements new regulation in 2023 that restricts the amount of electricity supplied to large businesses to foster enough supply for residential areas to avoid blackouts. Additionally, the environmental toll is observed as the country's landscape becomes increasingly barren, as lakes and forests are dug up to foster the construction of more mines, and CO2 emissions climb through the roof. Economically, on a global scale, Australia sees a decline in exploitation of energy supply as the industry becomes focused on meeting the needs of the domestic population. This has an effect on the GDP of the country, thus lowering their economic strength. Ultimately, this scenario sees Australia experience a backpedaling in the progress of forwarding our country as a global electricity supplier powerhouse, as our own domestic demand and supply problems are seen as more important. but this is also met with little to no regard for the health of the environmental landscape. The final future scenario sees an upturn in technological advancements, opposed to the neglect for the environmentally friendly behaviour. The industry actively is seeking a move away from the dependence on fossil fuels for energy supply, and aim for a much more nuclear-centred approach towards meeting the needs of the population. Funding from the government is pooled into the construction of infrastructure to support nuclear energy and research that analyses the long-term effectiveness of the nuclear approach. By 2029, the country's volume output of energy increases tenfold to support the domestic population and a growing number of international buyers who seek abundant quantities of energy but aim to avoid environmental impact on their own country. As demand increases, more uranium must be sourced to meet the needs of buyers, thus leading to more mines being opened up, once again contributing to degradation of the Australian landscape. Another problem that arises for the industry in this timeline is the disposal of radioactive waste. The funding for research into this area is yielding very little results, forcing waste product to be stockpiled in large quantities. This causes observable effects by 2032, with mutations seen in native wildlife in areas of waste disposal. From this comes a domino effect, as pressure groups start to voice their concerns and the industry makes its primary goal to find some form of disposal that disintegrates any radioactive waste. Rounding off this pathway, the industry experiences extreme pressure from domestic stakeholders, such as the government and citizens, to reduce the environmental impact their practices are having. Though, on the other hand, the industry has dug themselves a large hole as they have to continue to provide for international buyers who rely on the abundant energy source. This scenario illustrates conditions where technology advancements are at a low point and very little, if none, funding is invested into research of new renewable sources of energy. This leads to the government zeroing their focus onto